No nanny. The housekeeper bathed the baby in the kitchen sink, but when the millionaire father saw it. Katharina Hartman arrived at 97 Cedar Street, just as she did every morning, sharp at 7 a.m., with her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck and her cloth tote, carrying gloves and her favorite citrus-scented cleaner. She was never late, never needed to be reminded. For the past 3 years, she had worked in the grand home of renowned architect Daniel Rivera, quietly, diligently, and invisibly, just like the best housekeepers always are. The house was always silent in the early mornings. Daniel either left early for meetings or secluded himself in his third-floor study to draw. Katharina never disturbed him. She was not assigned anything related to the child, Jacob, just a year and a half old. Childcare was always the job of hired nannies. Katharina's only task was to keep the place clean, polished, and in perfect order. That morning the air was crisp. She was wiping down the staircase with warm, lemon-scented water when a piercing cry rang out from the second floor, shattering the stillness of the home. Katharina froze. That cry, urgent, desperate, unrelenting, felt like someone had been abandoned. Her heart pounded. She hesitated for a moment, considering walking away. But instinct overrode protocol. She ran up the stairs, her footsteps echoing against the hardwood. The nursery door was ajar. Jacob was in his crib, his face flushed red, tiny arms reaching desperately toward the door. The room was in disarray. Scattered toys, a strong, sour odor lingering in the air. He was soaked from head to toe, wearing a filthy onesie, cold and sticky against his skin. Katharina stood frozen. She looked around. No one. On the side table was a handwritten note. "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry. Don't try to contact me." Katharina's mind raced. She wasn't supposed to care for the child. That wasn't her job. But when Jacob's teary eyes met hers, when his tiny hands stretched out and his sobs turned into choked whimpers, she knew, if she didn't act, no one would. She stepped into the room slowly, lowered herself to the crib, and scooped him into her arms. His tiny body trembled against her chest. Jacob clung to her shirt collar, burying his face in her shoulder, the cries beginning to fade. Katharina stepped into the kitchen, still holding Jacob tightly in her arms. He had stopped crying, but each time she paused, his tiny hands clutched her collar again, afraid, as if terrified of being abandoned all over again. Her heart ached. She didn't know exactly what to do. She only knew one thing. The boy couldn't stay in this condition. Cold, soaked, skin sticky with urine, eyes swollen from too much crying. She checked the downstairs bathroom, a room she scrubbed every week, but it had no tub, only a standing shower, too tall and risky for a child barely 18 months old. The upstairs had a grand soaking tub inside Daniel's master suite, but Katharina was strictly forbidden from entering that space. The rules were clear. The boundaries had been drilled into her since day one. She stood frozen for a moment, then glanced at the large stainless steel sink in the corner of the kitchen. She had washed hundreds of pots in it. Never once imagined washing a baby. "Just for now, little one," she whispered, steadying her voice. "Let's get you clean and warm again." She laid a fresh towel at the bottom of the sink, tested the water temperature with her elbow, just like her mother once taught her. When the water was just warm enough, she began undressing Jacob, slow and gentle, murmuring as she went, "You're safe now. No one's leaving you again." Jacob didn't speak, but his eyes stayed locked on hers. Not with fear, but something else. A gaze that seemed to say he was searching for something, someone, somewhere to place his trust. She cupped water into her hand, trickling it over his soiled skin. Carefully, she washed each tiny finger, each curled toe. She lathered the soft curls atop his head, rinsing away the smell of neglect, replacing it with the soft scent of baby soap. As she bathed him, she hummed an old lullaby, half remembered, half improvised. Her voice was barely audible, the words unclear, but the tone warm and honest. Jacob listened. After a while, he began to smile, a real bright smile, followed by a string of soft babbles. Katharina smiled back. Something was happening, something sacred and instinctual. Not out of duty, not because it was her job, but because it was right. Because someone had to care. She had never been a mother, but at that moment she understood. You don't need to give birth to love like a mother. You just need a heart big enough. Once Jacob was clean, she wrapped him in a large towel, dried him gently, and found a fresh set of clothes in the linen closet. She dressed him slowly, slipping his little arms through the sleeves, zipping him up with hands that moved as if they'd done it 1,000 times. Jacob stirred in her arms, not crying, not fussing, just nuzzling into her chest as though he had found home there. She carried him to the living room, grabbed a soft blanket, and sat on the sofa with him nestled close. They stayed like that for a long time, neither moving, neither speaking. Jacob drifted off to sleep, breathing steady and soft. His tiny hand still clutched her finger. Katharina looked down at his peaceful face, rosy, round, serene, and felt that, no matter how complicated the world was, some moments were so simple they made you want to stay in them forever. She didn't know what would happen next. But she knew one thing. She had crossed a line. And she didn't regret it. Katharina was still sitting there on the sofa in the middle of the living room when the front door clicked open. The key turned gently in the lock, a familiar sound she'd heard for 3 years, yet this time it made her chest tighten. Jacob was still asleep in her arms, breathing steadily, his little hand still gripping her shirt like a tiny anchor in a turbulent sea. The door swung open. Daniel Rivera stepped inside, phone in hand, a wireless earpiece tucked into one ear. Katharina didn't move. Everything slowed. He paused in the entryway, his eyes scanning the room. In a few seconds, he took in the scene. Tiny shoes by the sofa, a damp towel draped over the chair, the faint scent of baby soap in the air, and finally, Katharina cradling his son, her face turned downward, a mix of exhaustion and peace glowing in the morning light. The earpiece dropped to the floor. Daniel strode forward. "What is going on here?" His voice was low, sharp, full of disbelief. Katharina looked up slightly, holding Jacob tighter on instinct. "Please, sir, don't wake him. He just fell asleep," she said gently but clearly. Daniel looked at his child, clean, dressed, cheeks rosy and calm. No signs of distress or fear, just a sleeping baby, safe in the arms of a woman he'd barely looked at for more than 30 seconds a day. He tightened his grip on his briefcase. "What did you do to my son?" he asked, not with anger, but with something else. Confusion. Katharina didn't flinch. She explained briefly. She had found Jacob alone, soaked, crying uncontrollably. The nanny had left, leaving a note on the table. No one else was home. Daniel listened, brow furrowed. The anger inside him no longer aimed at Katharina, but at something else, at the failure, at himself. He looked at Jacob, his son, who rarely met his gaze, now asleep peacefully in the arms of the housekeeper. "You're not supposed to care for my child," he said, still stern, but softer now. "I know," Katharina replied, eyes still on the sleeping boy. Silence. Daniel exhaled heavily, dragging a hand over his face as if to gather his scattered thoughts. "Give him to me," he said. Katharina hesitated, then slowly rose to her feet and gently transferred Jacob into his arms. But in that instant, like an instinctual jolt, Jacob stirred awake, eyes flying open, and began to cry. Loud, panicked sobs. His arms reached back toward Katharina, tears spilling down his cheeks. Daniel froze. He had never seen his son react this way. Katharina stepped forward. "Please, I think he's still scared." A brief moment. Daniel handed Jacob back, this time gently. And Jacob stopped crying, instantly, as if the world had just been set back in its rightful place. Daniel looked at them, saying nothing, but something inside him shifted, quietly, permanently. Daniel stood still, eyes fixed on Katharina, who gently rocked Jacob in her arms when the side door opened. The sound of heels echoed across the marble floor, announcing a familiar presence. Mrs. Celeste, the longtime housekeeper of the Rivera household, entered with her usual composed, unhurried demeanor. She stopped abruptly when she saw the scene before her, Daniel standing tense and the housemaid, Katharina, holding Jacob as if she were family. A brief flicker of disapproval crossed her face, but her voice remained smooth and firm. "Mr. Daniel, I had just stepped out to retrieve the supplier documents from the rear. I wasn't aware of any situation unfolding here." Daniel turned to her, his gaze sharp. "Where is the nanny?" Celeste blinked but quickly collected herself. "I believe she left? Perhaps an emergency?" "She left, abandoning the child alone, soaking wet and crying. A note on the table. You didn't notice?" Daniel's tone cut through the room, his anger barely restrained. Celeste lowered her head slightly. "I didn't expect her to act so irresponsibly." Katharina remained silent, holding Jacob a little closer as he stirred softly. In that moment, she could feel the tension thickening between the two. Daniel looked back at her. "Katharina, tell me everything from the beginning." She nodded and complied, her voice soft but unwavering. She described the cry, the filthy room, the note, the absence of anyone else, and the decision to bathe Jacob, because she couldn't bear to leave him like that. Celeste tried to interject, but Daniel raised a hand. "You had no authority to do any of that," Celeste said coldly once Katharina finished. "You are a cleaner. You're not allowed to touch the child, let alone enter private quarters." Daniel turned to the housekeeper. "Then who did have the authority, Celeste?" His voice was sharp. "The housemaid is the one holding my son, keeping him calm, and you, the one I entrusted to oversee everything, didn't even know he'd been left alone." Celeste stiffened. Daniel stepped closer. "I trust her. For the first time in a long while, I see Jacob at peace with someone. She didn't just clean. She did what any decent human being would have done." Katharina looked up, her eyes meeting Daniel's. He didn't look back, but his words had already struck something deep in her. "We'll talk later," Daniel said to Celeste. "Right now, I want time alone with my son, and the woman who saved him this morning." Mrs. Celeste inclined her head, then turned and walked out, her heels tapping rhythmically, as if that sound was the only thing she still controlled. The door closed. Only 3 people remained in the quiet room, and the air between them had shifted. Daniel stood quietly for a moment after Mrs. Celeste left, as if he were trying to organize the thoughts that had just unraveled inside his mind. Katharina remained standing, Jacob still in her arms, now fast asleep again, his features soft in the sunlight, filtering through the curtains. The room was silent, except for the steady ticking of the wall clock. "Please, sit down," Daniel said, his tone no longer sharp. Katharina hesitated, then gently sat, adjusting her posture so as not to wake the baby. Daniel pulled a chair across from her. His face no longer held anger, just weariness and something like uncertainty. He looked at Katharina as if he were truly seeing her for the first time. "I apologize if I overreacted," he said, voice low. "I didn't know. I didn't expect to come home and find my son in someone else's arms." Katharina nodded slowly. "I understand, sir." "Call me Daniel," he interrupted gently. She looked at him, surprised, then gave a small nod. "Yes, Daniel." A pause passed between them. Not uncomfortable, just quiet. "Have you ever worked with children before?" Daniel asked, his fingers absently spinning the wedding ring he no longer wore. Katharina looked down at Jacob before answering. "I volunteered at a children's shelter when I was in college. I wasn't studying childcare. I was studying business. But my heart was always with children." "Why didn't you pursue it?" Daniel asked. She smiled faintly, not out of joy. "I didn't think I was good enough, not qualified, not skilled enough, and I needed a stable job to survive." Daniel nodded slowly. In his eyes, something seemed to shift. Until now, Katharina had only ever been the cleaner. He had never thought of her name, never asked what she liked, never noticed the quiet sadness that followed her from room to room. "You've done an incredible job," he said. "Jacob has never reacted to anyone like that." Katharina lowered her gaze. "I didn't do it for praise. I just couldn't leave him like that." "And that's exactly how I know you have a heart," Daniel replied. "Something I might have forgotten existed in this house for a long time." Katharina said nothing. Jacob stirred softly, still clinging to her shirt. Daniel stood as if to leave, then turned back. "Katharina, thank you, truly." She looked up at him, and for the first time, they looked at each other not as employer and employee, but as two people, each carrying quiet emptiness, each holding words they had never dared to say aloud. "Katharina," Daniel said gently, "I want to ask you honestly, do you think I've spent enough time with Jacob?" Katharina hesitated. "You're a busy man, but children need to feel like they're a priority, not just a duty to fulfill." Silence fell between them. Daniel knew she was right. He looked at her for a long moment. "Would you be willing, if I asked, to care for Jacob as his primary caregiver?" Katharina was stunned. I don't have any official qualifications." "You have something far more valuable, love and a deeper understanding of Jacob than anyone else." Tears welled up in Katharina's eyes. "I'll take care of him with all my heart." After that conversation, something in Daniel began to shift, not loudly, not obviously, but deeply. He started paying more attention to things he once thought insignificant. The way Jacob looked up whenever Katharina entered a room, the way he squealed and reached out to be held when he saw her, or how he slept longer, cried less, and ate more when she was around. What struck Daniel most was Jacob's eyes, the way his son looked at her in a way he had never looked at him. Jacob wasn't an easy child. Since Daniel's wife passed away, nannies had come and gone. Some couldn't handle the night terrors. Others said he was too sensitive, too hard to bond with. Daniel understood. A baby who lost his mother before he could even recognize her? How could he not carry the weight? But no one had given Jacob the kind of comfort Katharina brought. Daniel remembered one afternoon, just days later. He came home earlier than usual from his office. Instead of the cold silence that normally greeted him, he heard soft laughter, childlike, bright, coming from the kitchen. He followed the sound. There was Katharina sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor with Jacob, playing a game called The Magic Box. It was a cardboard box filled with wooden spoons, plastic lids, and random trinkets. She hid an item inside and had him guess. Every time Jacob got it right, she'd squeal with delight, scoop him into her arms, and spin him around. He laughed uncontrollably, clapping, kicking his feet with pure joy. Daniel stood there watching for a long while. Neither of them noticed him. It was the first time he had ever seen his son truly laugh. Not a smile from being tickled, not a grin from liking his food, but a laugh that came from deep within, where fear had no place and love could grow. And Katharina, she wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't performing. She was simply present, fully, sincerely. Daniel backed away quietly and went upstairs, but that image replayed in his mind the entire evening. A week later, he began making an effort to be home in the evenings. No more late hours just to avoid the house. He wanted to try, to understand his son, and to do that, he needed to see the world through Katharina's eyes. She didn't teach him, not directly, but he learned from every small gesture, the way she crouched to meet Jacob at eye level, the way she never rushed him when he resisted, but waited until he was ready, the way she was patient, gentle, and firm all at once. Katharina wasn't like the other caregivers. She didn't come to complete a task. She came to be fully present, and Daniel began to understand. Not everyone can make a child feel safe, and not everyone can make a man like him want to come home. Since that day, Daniel's presence in the house was no longer a shadow passing behind closed doors. He began showing up in the evenings, sometimes earlier, sometimes just to sit at the dinner table and watch his son play on the rug. At first, Katharina felt uneasy. She wasn't used to Daniel being around. He had always been a distant figure, polite but cold. But now he often asked simple questions. How many meals did Jacob eat? What food does he like most? Or, did he cry much last night? She answered with short, clear responses. But gradually, those answers turned into little stories. She told him how Jacob reached for his teddy bear when he was sleepy, how he liked instrumental music in the morning. And Daniel listened, not just with his ears, but with his eyes, with presence. One evening after dinner, Daniel offered to put Jacob to bed. Katharina was surprised but nodded. She stood quietly beside him, watching. He held the boy a little awkwardly, unsure how to support him against his shoulder. But he didn't give up. Jacob squirmed, but didn't cry. When Daniel started to hum, a lullaby, offbeat and slightly clumsy, the child closed his eyes, fingers still gripping his father's shirt. Katharina smiled. For the first time, she didn't see Daniel as the cold, successful man she used to avoid, but as a father trying, step by step, to enter the fragile little world of his son. From that night on, evenings became a shared ritual. The three of them built towers from wooden blocks, read picture books, and laughed when Jacob dropped a block on Daniel's foot and giggled uncontrollably. One evening, while Jacob played quietly in the corner, Daniel handed Katharina a porcelain mug. "Do you drink tea?" She nodded, accepting it. For the first time, their hands brushed, just for a second, but enough to make her heart skip a beat. Neither said anything. But somehow, the room felt warmer. Trust doesn't arrive in a day. It is built from glances, honest questions, and small acts of kindness. Daniel began to realize Katharina wasn't just the maid. She was present, not only for Jacob, but for him too. The one who brought laughter, life, and warmth back into a house that had felt too empty for too long. And Katharina, she slowly allowed herself to believe. To trust that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't an outsider anymore. Maybe she belonged. A little. As autumn slipped into chillier days, the connection between the three of them began to evolve, not through words, but in the quiet spaces that spoke volumes. Daniel started spending more time at home. He worked from the ground floor study so he could hear Jacob's laughter or occasionally step out to see his son toddling across the living room, tiny hands clutching Katharina's fingers like she was the only anchor he needed. Katharina never asked why. She simply did her work, but her eyes no longer avoided Daniel's when they met. She began to smile when he joked about Jacob chewing on crayons or when he clumsily spilled her tea while trying to pour it. And Daniel found himself wanting to see that smile every day. One afternoon, with Jacob fast asleep, Daniel sat across from Katharina in the kitchen. Sunlight spilled through the window, catching in her hair, turning it the color of honey. He watched her a moment longer than usual. "Have you ever thought about having children?" he asked, his voice soft. Katharina paused mid-fold with a napkin in her hands. She looked up, surprised. "I've never seriously considered it," she said quietly. "There was a time I thought I'd become a teacher, but life led me somewhere else." Daniel nodded, but something in him dimmed. He had never asked her anything personal before, but now he wanted to know her past, her dreams, the sadness she kept so carefully tucked away behind silence. "Do you have any family?" he asked gently. Katharina pressed her lips together. "My mother passed away early. My father and we lost contact. I was raised by my aunt. She died 4 years ago." Her voice was calm, but her eyes lowered. Daniel wanted to say something, but didn't, because he knew what she had just shared, though simple, was a kind of trust. A door left slightly open, and inside Daniel something was more clear than ever. He didn't just appreciate her for what she did for Jacob. He was grateful for how she brought life back into this house. Across the room, Katharina was struggling with her own emotions. She was beginning to see that Daniel's eyes no longer looked at her like an employer's. There was care there, presence, a warmth she had once believed was never meant for her. But inside her stood a quiet wall. Who am I in this house? Do I have the right to step closer? Or is this all temporary? One day, while she was dressing Jacob in his room, the little boy suddenly cupped her face in both hands, looked deeply into her eyes, and said, "Mommy?" Katharina froze. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Daniel stood in the doorway. He heard it, said nothing. But his eyes, so soft, so full, made her look away. Feelings, though unspoken, were now unmistakably real, present, full, and no longer hiding. It was a quiet night. A light breeze rustled the trees out front. The autumn sky held no moon, but stars were scattered across it like soft lights. In the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon cookies from earlier still lingered in the air. Jacob was fast asleep in his room. Katharina was finishing the dishes when Daniel walked in, holding 2 mugs, one for her, one for him. "Is coffee too late?" he asked, half joking. She smiled softly. "As long as it's not too bitter." He poured her a small cup and sat across from her at the kitchen table. Katharina dried her hands, took a seat, and wrapped her fingers around the mug, letting the warmth soak into her palms. They sat in silence for a while. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful. Daniel looked at her. "I've been thinking a lot. About you, about Jacob, about this house." Katharina froze slightly. She set her cup down gently. "You know," he continued, voice steady, "I once thought I could go the rest of my life without letting anyone into my heart again. But then you came, and everything slowly started to change." She said nothing. Her heart pounded. Daniel lowered his gaze, hands clasped on the table. "Jacob needs you," he said. "But I think I do too." She looked at him, eyes wide with surprise. "Not because you clean well, or because you're good with him, but because you bring something I lost a long time ago. Trust, peace, the feeling of coming home." Katharina lowered her head. Her hands trembled slightly. She had never imagined that one day the man who once seemed carved from stone would speak to her this way. Daniel took a breath. "I don't know if this is sudden, but I wanted to ask." She looked up. Their eyes met. Would you consider it's becoming Jacob's full-time caregiver, living here, staying with us, as part of the family?" Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what she was expecting. A confession? Something bigger? But that offer, simple as it was, left her speechless. Because in it, there was something undeniable. A quiet admission, an open door. She swallowed. "Are you sure? That's not what I was hired for." For the first time, she said "I" like she belonged. Daniel smiled. "I've never been more sure." Nothing else needed to be said, but in their eyes there was an unspoken promise. No rush, no need to hurry, just one step toward each other. A week after that offer, not much had visibly changed. Katharina still did her work as usual, waking early, making breakfast, playing with Jacob with all the warmth she had. But something in the air had shifted, lighter, warmer, and Daniel looked at her differently, no longer as an employer, but as someone waiting for her to open her heart, waiting for the right moment. That evening, a gentle rain fell outside. The wind slipped through the windows, carrying the scent of damp earth and the last roses of the season. Jacob had fallen asleep earlier than usual, lulled by a bedtime story Daniel had read, long-winded and poorly delivered, but full of love. Katharina sat on the sofa, holding an unopened book, eyes drifting toward the window. Daniel walked in, holding a small wooden box. Not a ring box, no ribbon, just a simple, worn box that had likely been kept for years. He sat beside her. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice low but tender. She looked at him, surprised. "Afraid of what?" "Of stepping into a family. That's not perfect," he said, eyes on the box. "Of walking into the heart of a man who once locked every door. Of joining a life that hasn't been easy for either of us." She said nothing. Daniel opened the box. Inside was a small bracelet made of thin rope, worn, clean, humble. It seemed meaningless at first, but his hand trembled slightly as he picked it up. "My wife made this while she was pregnant with Jacob," he said quietly. "She said she'd give it to him when he started walking, but she never got the chance." He took a breath, then held the bracelet out to her. "I've kept it for 3 years, never gave it to anyone, never thought anyone deserved it, until I saw Jacob call you Mom. And you didn't correct him." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. Daniel didn't kneel. He didn't ask, "Will you marry me?" He simply said softly, "Be my wife, be Jacob's mother, be our family." That was all. But Katharina understood. Every word came from the deepest part of his heart. She nodded, didn't speak, just reached out, accepted the bracelet, and wrapped her arms around him, lightly but surely. And in that rainy night, beneath the soft kitchen light, there were no fireworks, no crowd, just 2 people and a love that had finally bloomed. A family made whole. A love that arrived late but would last forever. The house, once quiet and cold like winter, had transformed. Every morning the kitchen filled with the sound of Jacob's giggles, a now 2.5-year-old with soft curls and eyes that sparkled like sunlight. He ran down the hallways with his worn-out teddy bear, the same one Katharina had cleaned for him on that fateful day long ago. Each afternoon he would crawl into Daddy Daniel's lap, babbling about nonsense and tugging at his favorite shirt button. And Katharina, now Daniel's wife, sat by the window, her hand resting gently on her growing belly, where a new life blossomed. They were married in the spring. A small ceremony in the garden, surrounded by white flowers, soft sunlight, and the warmth of those who truly cared. No luxury, no fanfare, just love and a promise to stay. Since then, every corner of the house had changed. The framed photos on the wall were no longer landscapes, but family pictures, Daniel, Katharina, and Jacob, smiling beneath the trees. The living room always smelled of baked cookies and echoed with children's songs. Even Daniel's study had changed. His desk now held a small frame of Jacob asleep on his shoulder. One rainy afternoon, Katharina sat in her armchair, reading a storybook to Jacob. But he was too wiggly to stay still, climbing over her belly and onto Daniel's lap. Daniel chuckled, catching him. "Are you my little monkey today?" he teased, ruffling Jacob's hair. Jacob nodded enthusiastically, then suddenly wrapped his arms around both of them, resting his cheek on Katharina's shoulder, giggling. And then, as naturally as breathing, he whispered, "Mommy! Daddy!" Both adults went still. Katharina's eyes glistened. Daniel pulled them close, kissing Jacob's forehead. No one said anything. They didn't need to. That one word, "Mommy, Daddy," was enough. Enough to erase years of loneliness. Enough to heal wounds left unspoken. Life wasn't perfect. There were still fevers, sleepless nights, and occasional disagreements. But love, once a stranger in this house, had found a home, firmly rooted. In 1 month, they would welcome another child. Jacob would become a big brother. "Do you want a baby sibling?" Daniel had once asked him. Jacob thought for a long while, then nodded solemnly. "I'll share my cookies." Katharina laughed. Daniel simply took her hand, firm and steady, just like the promise they had made, to build a family from what was once broken, from losses no one could name. And now, as the evening light poured through the windows, Jacob's laughter echoed once more, clear and bright like spring's first bell. They needed nothing more. A home, a hand to hold, a family.